Good afternoon, church. Uh, Before I start my sermon, let me share a few words about myself. Some of you asked me this morning if I still study at Newbold College. Well, that was a long time ago. I completed my studies several years ago. So at Newbold College I teach. Old Testament studies are my area of teaching. I teach at both undergraduate and postgraduate studies, and I'm the undergraduate program director. My specialty is the book of Daniel, and I've heard in the information this morning that you're at Daniel 3, and you're using the book of Uriah Smith. All the best about Uriah Smith, but he's very old-fashioned. And probably you should find some other books because there are at least two commentaries published in 21st century by two Seventh Adventist theologians, and the newest commentary will come probably this or next year about the book of Daniel. So if you like, I can tell you their names. So you should find the book written by Jacques Ducan. That's The Secrets of Daniel. It was published in 2000, and the second commentary is the commentary of the book on the book of Daniel, Wisdom to the Wise, by Zdravko Stefanovic. I met them both in Rome last month, and we had a good chat. And Dr. Ducan told me that he's publishing his second commentary probably this or next year. So I would recommend these books to you. Uriah Smith is good for historical reading, but if you would like something very fresh from 21st century, remember these two names, Ducan and Stefanovic. You can find these two books in ABC Shop over internet, or you can talk to the people in Stamborough Press, and you can order them through Stamborough Press. Okay, the topic for today is it's not easy to be God. Probably a year ago or less, I read again, probably for my fifth or sixth time, the book called Sabbath or Shabbat by Abraham Heschel. And that's a very tiny book, probably less than 100 pages long, but it's so full of good ideas and thoughts about Sabbath that I think that this is one of the best books written on the topic of Sabbath. Although I do not agree with all the points in this book, but I can tell you that this is a very good book. Abraham Heschel was a Jewish rabbi. He lived in 21st century. He was born on the territory of today's Poland. He completed his studies in Germany, and just before the start of the World War II, he escaped somehow to the United States. In the States, he spent all his time in teaching Jewish mysticism and theology and ethics at the New York Yeshiva in the United States. He wrote several books, and he was a remarkable person. And one of these books, probably the best known, is the book about Shabbat. And I have the edition where the forewords of this book was written by his daughter, Susanna Heschel. Susanna Heschel is also a Jewish theologian. And among the other things in this foreword, she mentions several biographical events or events from the life of her father. And she mentions there how he observed the Sabbath. He was an Orthodox Jew, how he understood Sabbath in some of the conversations. And actually she, at the end of this foreword, she described his last Sabbath before he died. And it was Friday night. They had some guests in their house. And after some time, her father said to his guests, I need to go to bed. I would like to have some night rest. He shook hands with his friends, with his family, and he left to his bedroom to have a sleep. But he never woke up back. Actually, he died in his sleep. And his daughter, Susanna Heschel, describes this event, and she says that in Jewish tradition, for people who die on Sabbath, that's a special sign that God had a special relationship with them. But most importantly, she said that when people die in their sleep, the Jews call it the kiss of God. Because they think that this way of dying is probably the easiest way to die. People go to sleep and they never woke up. So basically, I was intrigued by this idea, the kiss of God. And from my experience in research, I know that whatever phrase is usually used in the Jewish tradition, usually some of these phrases and events, they come from the Bible. And I was quite intrigued to find out where the kiss of God could be found in the Bible. And actually this idea, this expression, is found in the book of Deuteronomy 34. And we actually read these verses where this phrase is mentioned. However, it was not translated in that way, but I'll help you later. Let me give you a few thoughts about the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy is part of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And as you know, not every single book of the Pentateuch covers the same internal chronology. For example, Genesis is divided into 50 chapters. And Genesis covers probably several thousands of years of time, from the creation until the death of Joseph. But when you go to the book of Exodus, these 2 chapters, they cover probably several decades of time. And then you jump from that time between chapters 2 and 3 in Exodus, probably for 40 years. And in Exodus 3, you've got the call of Moses. And between the call of Moses and until Numbers, chapter 10 and 11, you've got only year and a half. So the writer of the Pentateuch actually wanted to tell us that there are some emphasis. And certain emphasis is quite visible when the author of the book, when they wanted us to spend time of reading for a short period of chronology. For example, the book of Deuteronomy covers only 1 or 2 days. And basically the book of Deuteronomy is made of Moses' speeches. And basically the book of Deuteronomy repeats or retells many of the events from the book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And what is very interesting, in chapter 34, Moses is not the speaker, but a third-person narrator emerges from this chapter. Between chapter 1 and 33 in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is the speaker. And you've got in Deuteronomy all this series of Moses' speeches. But in Deuteronomy 34, you've got Moses, who is only an actor of the narration, but somebody else is doing the narration. Narration is about Moses, who is going up to the top of Mountain Nebo, and actually God is showing him the promised land. You know from the book of Numbers and Deuteronomy that on several occasions the Israelites, they tried to enter the promised land. They tried to enter the promised land to the land of Edom, and they refused them. And God told them, do not make war with Edom, because they are your cousins, your brothers. And they asked also Ammon and Moab to go through their territories, and they were not allowed. So they needed to go from the east, and they actually entered the promised land from the east. And that was the reason why they needed to cross River Jordan. Actually, they came out of Egypt, which is on the south from the promised land. But instead of going straight there, they went from the eastern side. Now, Moses is on the eastern side, on the mountain Nebo, and he is viewing, seeing, looking at the promised land. And the text says that he looked from the north, he looked towards west until the Great Sea, Mediterranean. He looked on the south, and he looked just in front of him on the east. And he saw the promised land. However, God said to him in verse 4, this is the land I promised to your ancestors, that I will give to their descendants. However, you, Moses, you are not going to enter the promised land. Wow. Moses, he spent last 40 years of his life to a very demanding task to bring people of God from Egypt to the promised land. And in all those 40 years, he had many challenges. And he had overcome all these challenges. And now he was on the brink of the promised land, and he can't enter. If you would like to know why, you need to go back to Numbers 20, verses from 1 to 13, and you also have to go to Deuteronomy 3. At the end of the chapter, there is a repetition what God told Moses when he requested again, may I come, may I enter the promised land. Actually, why God did not allow Moses to enter the promised land? When you go to Numbers 20, we can see a very familiar scene. The people of God suddenly are in a situation without water, and they start crying against Moses and Aaron and telling them, what is this? We don't have water to drink. In Egypt, we had everything better. We had water, we had figs, we had vineyards, we had pomegranates, we had everything. Now we here have nothing. And they started rumbling. They started rioting against Moses and Aaron. And Moses and Aaron, they went to the tent of the meeting. They fell down on their faces and they prayed to God. And God answered to their prayer, saying, go to that rock and tell that rock to give water to the sons of Israel. Moses and his brother got up. They went to the rock. And now this is the key event. Instead of commanding the rock to give water, and instead of talking to the rock, they started talking to the people. And Moses said, "O you rebels, what do you think? Are you going to get water or not?" And he took his rod and he struck the rock twice, and the water poured down. And the water came out, and they drank that water. And the need of the people was satisfied entirely. However, in verse 12, Numbers chapter 20, God said to Aaron and Moses something very serious. Numbers 20, verse 12. "But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me to show my holiness before the eyes of the Israelites, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them." End of story. Now, we have two groups of people. We have Moses and Aaron as the leadership, and we have these people. When you compare the behavior of Moses especially to the behavior of the people he led, who was the positive and who was the negative person or group there? Who was the positive? Moses. He was always with God. Even at one occasion, he interceded between God and his people not to be destroyed. Why? Because they built a metallic calf just at the base of the Mount Sinai. And God actually, with his interceding, he saved his people. And on many other occasions, his wisdom, his closeness with God, his calmness saved the Israelites and their lives. Am I right? Moses actually, later we'll read that in the book of Deuteronomy 34, that he was one of the best leaders of Israelites in the Old Testament. However, God allowed these people to get into the promised land, but he did not allow Moses and Aaron to get into the promised land. Am I right? Why? Why? Because God says, you did not trust in me, and because you did not show my holiness before the Israelites. Is this so serious? Is this so serious? It's not easy to be God. On one side, God is the most powerful person in the universe. But at the same time, he is the most righteous person in the universe. And although God is love and justice, sometimes seems to us that this is not very easy even for God to practice. Because, let me tell you, why God wouldn't allow Moses to get into the promised land. He forgave so many more serious, in our eyes, more serious sins to Israel, and he's not forgiving Moses now. Because God, he had something to show and present his people. And God was adamant. God was very adamant to fulfill this prohibition, not to let Moses in. But at the same time, God wanted to do something very special for Moses. he called him alone to come to the top of the mountain. And the text says that the Moses was 120 years old, and his eyes didn't lose their function, and his health was very good. So when Moses died, at the age of 120 years, there was no biological reason for him to die. There was no physiological reason for him to die. He wasn't ill, and despite of his ripened age, he was in a very good physical condition. So why did Moses die? He died because God caused his death. And now, when I discovered that in the book of Abraham Heschel, what his daughter wrote about his death, I was intrigued about that kiss of God. And because I know that our translations are not perfect, I decided to go into the original language. And when you read the original language of the Bible, which is mostly in the Old Testament Hebrew, that slows you down in your reading. Because you would like to pay attention to every single word, and you would like to make connection with that word with other words in the sentence. And this is good, because the rabbis, they say that the book is not for reading, that the Bible is not for reading, but the Bible is for studying. That's why we need to read that slowly. But when you read translation, you're so familiar with that translation that when you read, you skip over certain words and you don't take them seriously. That's one thing. And secondly, very often the translators of the Bible give you the best solution of the original language meaning, which is not always what the original text says, but it's the best expressed in the language that the Bible is translated. And I started reading in the original language. And the picture I'm having here is the picture of great intimacy between God and Moses. That's actually an event of a meeting between father and son. And Moses is approaching the top of the mountain. God is telling him something. And the text says this, that Moses, verse 5, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab. And in your translation says, in my translation says, at the Lord's command, or according to the word of God. Am I right? Now, this is semantically very good translation. But actually, in the original Hebrew language, it says, Al Paneh Adonai, which literally means that Moses died on God's lips. The text is saying that Moses died on God's lips. That's why the Jews said, when somebody's dying with easy death, that's the kiss of God. And the picture is a picture of intimacy. How God is kissing Moses and he's dying. Moses is dying. And the text says, verse 6, he was buried in a valley in the land of Moab. This is bad translation, because the original language says, he buried Moses in the valley of Moab. So God buried Moses. And this imagery for me is very touching, When I read that in the original language, I started crying, because this is a picture of father and son, and the son is dying. And this is not a usual picture in the Pentateuch. In the Pentateuch, usually father dies and his children bury him. Abraham died and his sons buried him. Jacob died, Isaac died, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. Jacob died, his sons buried him. Joseph died, his sons buried him. So the usual order in the Bible is that the parent is dying and the children is burying them. But in this picture is that the child is dying and the parent is burying them. There is no greater tragedy. There is no greater fear in the heart of every single parent than this event. There is no greater pain in our lives than when a parent is burying their child. And God has been burying his children since the time of Abel until the very today. Billions of people. And God attends every burial, every funeral. It's not easy to be God. But why God did not spare himself of this pain? Why God did not just forgive Moses and say, it doesn't matter. You are in a good shape. You are in a good physical and mental health. Yes, I am forgiving you and you should go to the promised land. But this didn't happen. And the big question is why? Because remember, God is not like us. We, as human beings, when we need to make a big decision, difficult decision, that costs us pain and suffering, we are quite in a difficult position. Also, when we make some very important decision, we are under the influence of other people as well, of the environment. And very often it's very difficult. But God is not like that. God is a perfect being. He is the most powerful person in the universe. He is love. He is justice. And he can forgive. But he decided not to forgive Moses. Why? He didn't have outside pressure. We don't know from the text what happened into God's heart at that time. But we know this, that God was very adamant. You're not going to get into this place because I'm not allowing you, because you didn't trust me, and because you didn't show my holiness. Why is this so important? Why is this important that Moses and Aaron did not show trust and holiness to the people of God? Let me tell you why is this important. Point number one, Moses was not anybody in Israel at that time. He was the leader. And let me tell you what the Israelites taught about Moses. Deuteronomy 34, 10 to 12. Never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Actually, the text is saying not face to face, but lips to lips. Again, the same imagery. So Moses was a special person that, differently to any other prophet and leader in the Old Testament, he was in a very special position because he talked to God face to face or lips to lips. Verse 11, he was unequaled for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his servants and his entire land, and for all the mighty deeds and all the terrifying displays of power that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. In the sight of all Israel, all these miracles, powerful deeds were made. So, what was the perception of Moses? Moses was a very special person, like none of the prophets of the Old Testament. And secondly, whatever Moses did in God's name, he did in front of the Israelites. All these powerful things. If you go back to the book of Exodus, who told or who announced the Ten Commandments publicly? Who? Not Moses, but God himself. He announced the Ten Commandments, and God himself wrote those commandments onto tablets. However, people of Israel, they said to Moses, we are afraid when God speaks to us directly. So, because we are afraid, let him talk to you, and then you can talk to us. And God agreed to that, and Moses agreed to them. So from that point, somewhere in the second part of the book of Exodus, until Deuteronomy 33, Moses was the spokesperson of God. So whatever he said because God told him like that. And Israel accepted this as the word of God. Are you with me? So basically, Moses was the spokesperson, and if you like that, for them, Moses was like God. Now, let me bring into our position. For many people, you and me, we are the face of Adventism. They do not know all 18, 19, 20 million Adventists around the world. But people in your working place, they know you. People at the university, they know you. People in the school, they know you. People in the neighborhood, they know you. And when you say to them, I'm an Adventist, you are actually Adventism. Adventist church to them. You are the representative. And whatever you say, whatever the way you behave, for them, that's the way how the Adventists speak, and that's the way how the Adventists behave. Now, let me go back to Numbers 20, verse 12. God says to Moses and to Aaron, you did not trust in me, and you did not show my holiness. Trust in God is the basic concept how we have a relationship with God. Trust, faith, is the basic concept, is the basic tool, if you like, how we maintain our relationship with God. Without faith, Hebrews 11 say that we can't satisfy God. So trust is something very essential, elementary for our relationship to God. And Moses, actually, he was an example how trust should look like. Because if he did not trust God, then who? If he did not have perfect relationship with God, then who? So basically, Moses was a picture, a model, an example. What does it mean to trust? Secondly, God says, you didn't show them my holiness. What does it mean, holiness? In the Old Testament, especially in the Pentateuch, you've got several aspects of what is holiness. Aspect number one, holiness is the essence of God's nature. That's the essence of His being. And holiness is not something that God can project. Holiness is not something that God can give. Holiness is something where God is. Exodus 3. Moses is looking at a very special phenomenon. A bush, burning bush, but the bush is there, the fire is there, and usually when the fire is there, the bush is not there. But the bush is burning, but it's still there. And he was quite perplexed by that. And he went to see that phenomenon. And God suddenly said to him, take off your sandals, because the ground you are standing on is holy. Why is the ground holy? It's not because of the ground itself, but because God is there. Probably you're not familiar with other types of Christianity like traditional Roman Catholic or traditional Eastern Orthodox Christianity. But in these two traditional Christian churches, denominations, they have something that they call sacraments. Sacraments could be some liturgical events like communion, and also sacraments could be some holy objects. And especially in the Eastern Orthodox Church, they admire, they almost worship, they bow down in front of the bones of the saints. And people in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, they are ready to travel miles and miles in order to kiss or bow down in front of these holy objects, in order to get better health, in order to get children, in order to get good results at their A levels or whatever. So whatever is their dire need, they go, they bow down in front of the objects, and they kiss them, whatever. And now, there is a church or monastery somewhere in Montenegro, and they believe that this part of the hands, of the arm of John the Baptist is there. And people go there in great numbers, especially during holidays in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, in order to bow down or kiss the casket where this arm is. Because they believe that in that way, they'll get some health, they'll get some benefit. In theology, this is known as sacramentalism, because you don't know what to do, but you're just there and you do the proper procedure, and if you do the proper procedure, you'll be blessed. In the Bible, it's not like that. In the Bible, you need to know God. You need to trust Him. You need to have a proper relationship. And when you bow down in front of Him, you have to know who is He. So holiness is not an object. Holiness is an active presence of God in your life. Secondly, holiness is something that is completely opposite of sinfulness. And let me tell you, whenever in the Bible sinful people met holy God, what was the reaction of the sinful people? Rejoice? Praise? No. Fear. Suffering. Being ashamed. When Daniel saw God, when he saw Michael in Daniel 10, he bowed down and he lost his conscience. When Peter became aware in his own boat that the person standing there is not a young rabbi from Galilee, but that young rabbi is actually God in human body, he said what? Please get out of my boat. I'm a sinful person. So sinfulness is totally opposite of holiness. Third aspect, holiness has a moral dimension. Holiness has ethical dimension. What is right and what is wrong. And holiness is always about what is right. And God very often, especially in the book of Leviticus, he would say, I'm holy, and because I'm holy, you should love your neighbor as yourself. You should not steal. You should treat your brother or sister with dignity. You should do this right, you should do that right. So holiness in the Bible is connected with doing good, with being good, with being right and just. So how people, even today, how do they understand that God is just? How do they understand that God is love? They read the Bible. But before they read the Bible, they usually meet somebody who has read the Bible before them. And be very honest. I'm going to be honest. Before I started reading the Bible and knowing God from the Bible, I had meetings with people who claimed that they had read the Bible. And basically I started believing them, and because of my trust in them, I started reading the Bible. Because these people for me, they were walking Bible for me. Because of that testimony that they met God, I believe them. So Moses was the person who spent 40 nights and days on the Mount Sinai. He was the person, whenever they were in trouble, he would go into the tent of meeting and he would find solution because God would tell him, do this, do that. And for them, Moses was not just a troubleshooter. Moses for them was the voice of God. And that day, when he called them rebels, he was wrong, not in that classification. They were rebels indeed. But he was wrong because he didn't pass the right message of God to them. He was guilty, if you like, because he did not show God's holiness in front of them. My brothers and sisters, this city, this town, or the town where you live, the workplace you work, the place where you study, the school you attend, they don't know God, many of them. But the moment when you say, I'm a Christian, I'm a person who believes in God, I'm a person who reads the Bible, when you said that, for them, you are the picture of God. What are we showing them? What do we tell them? Holiness, trust, or something else? The Bible says that God takes our ministry very serious. And he takes our testimony to other people very serious. And we would like to go into the promised land. And I believe that Moses, he went into a better promised land than the land of Israel. Do you believe the same? But it was very important for Moses to get into the promised land. Why? Because his best years he spends into building a nation. He spent the best years of his life in order to persuade people that there is a promised land. And suddenly, he didn't get there. My brothers and sisters, God has called us to be his witness. God has called us to be his walking Bibles. God has called us to be Moses to certain people. The question is, are we what God plans with us? My prayer and my wish is that every single member this morning, this afternoon, would be better than Moses. And that every one of us would show people around us that we were with God this morning. That one day they will say to you, when you visit my house, that day for me was a special day. Very long in my life, I just wondered whether I'm doing my job properly. And for example, whenever I would encounter people and give Bible studies, those people would be impressed by my knowledge. And I always had this complex, why they're impressed by my knowledge? Where is God in all this? Why it's all about me and about my knowledge of the Bible? Until I met a family 3-4 years ago in a very dramatic circumstances. And I started visiting them. They were in a very dire state. Their father was dying, and eventually he died. Their mother, she was ill. The two sisters in their 30s, they were both ill. And at the same time, they were very eager to know God. And I started visiting them. And when I needed to come to England, I told them that I can't come anymore. One of my colleagues will continue to come. And I would come and visit them every Thursday, either in the morning or in the